we are in the midst of a sermon series that began a couple weeks ago on the book of Romans. This is actually our third week, and if you've been paying attention, Peter was here in the first week of the series. He gave us an introduction to the book of Romans. Last week, Doug taught on Romans 12, and this week we're looking at Romans 13. If you're fully awake this morning, you may have noticed that we went straight from the introduction of Romans right into Romans 12 and 13, and that might strike you as a little bit odd. We're following the advice of a New Testament scholar by the name of Scott McKnight, who suggests that it might be easier, it might be more accessible for us to read the book of Romans backwards. So we're not reading the book of Romans strictly backwards. We're kind of going in a bit of a sequence. We're going to look at 12 through 16, and then we're going to kind of go back and cover the earlier chapters. But the point that he's trying to make is that the complex arguments that show up in Romans 1 to 11 often discourage us and kind of feel heavy, so that by the time we get to the very practical advice that Paul is trying to get to in his letter, which shows up in 12 through 16, we've kind of lost momentum. So instead of actually kind of getting bogged down in all of the details of 1 to 11, what we're going to do is we're going to look at the practical advice that Paul gives for the church in Romans 12 through 16, and then we're going to go back and reflect on the ways that Paul got to that place. What was the argumentation that brought him there? What was the theology that he wanted to bring forward that results in that particular application? The issue for the church in Rome is this. It's the issue of the inability of the privileged and powerful, the strong, as Paul calls them, to embody the gospel's inclusive demand and include the disprivileged and the disempowered, or what Paul calls the weak. Very simply put, it's an issue of unity that the church is wrestling with, and this is what Doug brought to us last week, a reflection on that lack of unity in the church and the challenge of the strong and the weak coming together in one church. Romans 1 to 11 offer a rationale for a lived theology that Paul then gives to his readers in Romans 12 through 16. Why should they seek the good of one another? Because God has made them one in Christ, with one Spirit. They both have the same salvation, the same Spirit, they serve the same King, and they have the same Father. So Doug pointed out last week that one of the reasons for this division in the church relates back to the fact that the Roman church was initially established by Jewish believers who were coming back after Pentecost. So when you read in Acts 2, we've got this early explosion of the church in Acts chapter 2, right? The Spirit is poured out. Peter preaches a great sermon explaining the gospel, and thousands of people come to faith in Jesus from all over the place. And the assumption that we have, or what history would indicate, is that the church in Rome was initially founded, it was initially started by these Jewish believers who were back in Jerusalem for Pentecost or for Passover, and who are now being sent back. Or now went back to Rome and established the church. So the beginnings of the church was very Jewish in Rome. As this Jewish church began, they began proclaiming the gospel, and many Gentiles came to faith. And that church kind of hit a problem when in AD 49, Emperor Claudius exiled all of the Jews from Rome. So you've got this church that's growing up. It's got a strong Jewish base. Gentiles start being added. Non-Jews start being added to the mix. And then, quite abruptly, a number of years later, the emperor exiles all of the Jews, and suddenly all that's left in that church would be the Gentile believers. And that exile took place, and then within about 5 years, it's thought that they were allowed to return. The Jewish people were allowed to return to Rome. And then you've got this conflict, because this church that has grown up in Rome increasingly feels very non-Jewish. It's being run by Gentiles. So you can imagine these Jewish followers of Jesus who come back into Rome, back to the churches that they founded, and they find that they've become a minority. They're the smaller number of people in the church. They find that the church has grown up differently maybe than they might have supposed. They find maybe some pork-eating non-Jews who are running the church. We see that they're not particularly connected necessarily to the Mosaic laws. And there's this conflict that arises in the church between what Paul calls the strong and the weak. And in this case, Paul refers to the Gentile believers, the non-Jewish believers, as the strong. They're the ones who aren't bound by the laws. And he refers to the Jewish believers as the weak. And his point isn't to say that the strong are all right and the weak are all wrong, but to say the strong and the weak need to learn to live together as one family. And this is the context. This is what we're reading when we come to the gospel of, to the book of Romans. I say this because I want you to feel the way that they would have felt when this book was read to them. Okay? So the book of Romans it was a book that would have, a letter written by Paul that would have been performed to the churches. So it was dictated, and then somebody would have been taught, and the indication is that that person was Phoebe. At the end of Romans, you get this picture of this person, Phoebe, and Phoebe would have been taught to perform the book of Romans, to actually read the book of Romans out loud. She would have memorized the bulk of the book, and she would have gone around to the different house churches, and she would have read it out loud. And the way that she would have read it with great expression. She would have read it with an expectation that there would be lots of questions and lots of concerns, that this would be a vocal group of people that she was reading it to. And most likely, she would have read it with Paul having told her, these are the specific issues in the church that I want you to respond to. So she would have had people in mind that Paul would have said, hey, watch out for Medad in the front row. Make sure when you say this, when you read this line, you look him directly in the eyes. Okay? When this letter would have been read out loud, they knew there was some tension, because the letter was addressing specific problems that took place within the church. So I want you to feel some of that as we read Romans 13 together, because Romans 13 is a hard text. It's one that would have brought some frustration to certain groups of people within the church. And I want you to feel that as we come to this text, the sense that there would have been a frustration, because within that church where we've got the strong and the weak, we've got one group of people who are very comfortable with the government, and we've got one group and another group of people, a minority, who have been exiled for the last number of years and have an uncomfortable relationship with the government. And now Paul's going to tell them some advice about how do we actually deal with the government. How do we as followers of Jesus interact with civil authority? Finally, before I read it, let me say this. Paul isn't trying to say everything about how believers relate to civil authority. Romans 13 is one of the big passages that we go to as a church that tells us something about how we relate to the government. However, Paul's intention in writing this is not to say everything that you need to know. The title of the chapter is not everything that you need to know about how we relate to the government. Rather, this is a specific letter addressed to a specific people at a specific time, and Paul is trying to address some very specific issues with them. So we need to keep that in mind as we read it if we're going to be able to make sense of it. In fact, Paul may have written something different if he had written it 10 years later, because at the moment when Paul wrote it, it wasn't a moment of great persecution in Rome. The church had great freedom. And yet 10 years later, we know that the Emperor Nero is persecuting the church with great zeal. And many thousands of believers are being killed for their faith. So Paul may have had something different to say at that point in history, but we're reading at a particular point. And yet it has something to say to us today. So let's read it together. Romans 13. Let everyone be subject to the governing authorities, for there is no authority except that which God has established. The authorities that exist have been established by God. Consequently, whoever rebels against the authority is rebelling against what God has instituted, and those who do so will bring judgment on themselves. For rulers hold no terror for those who do right, but for those who do wrong. Do you want to be free from fear of the one in authority? Then do what is right, and you will be commended. For the one in authority is God's servant for your good. But if you do wrong, be afraid, for rulers do not bear the sword for no reason. They are God's servants, agents of wrath to bring punishment on the wrongdoer. Therefore, it is necessary to submit to the authorities, not only because of possible punishment, but also as a matter of conscience. This is also why you pay taxes, for the authorities are God's servants, who give their full time to governing. Give to everyone what you owe them. If you owe taxes, pay taxes. If revenue, then revenue. If respect, then respect. If honor, then honor. Let no debt remain outstanding except the continuing debt to love one another. For whoever loves others has fulfilled the law. The commandments, you shall not commit adultery, you shall not murder, you shall not steal, you shall not covet, and whatever other command there may be, are summed up in this one command: love your neighbor as yourself. Love does no harm to a neighbor. Therefore, love is the fulfillment of the law. And do this, understanding the present time. The hour has already come for you to wake up from your slumber, because our salvation is nearer now than when we first believed. The night is nearly over, the day is almost here. So let us put aside the deeds of darkness and put on the armor of light. Let us behave decently, as in the daytime, not in carousing and drunkenness, not in sexual immorality and debauchery, not in dissension and jealousy. Rather, clothe yourselves with the Lord Jesus Christ, and do not think about how to gratify the desires of the flesh. So, a hard text. Let's walk through it slowly together. I'm going to be honest, we're going to spend the bulk of our time on the first half of the text, looking at our relationship with government, and then we'll kind of hit the tail end as we wind down. So, first point, the chapter begins with some difficult teaching. Paul makes it really clear through repetition, he says it repeatedly, that everyone needs to submit to the governing authorities. And why do we need to submit to the governing authorities? Well, I want to propose 3 reasons. One of the commentaries I read that was really helpful was from Tim Keller in New York. Tim's a pastor there, and he proposes 3 kind of main reasons why we need to actually submit to authority. First of all, because it's right. Let everyone be subject to the governing authorities, for there is no authority except that which God has established. The authorities that exist have been established by God. Paul isn't saying anything new here. He's echoing the words of the Old Testament and even the words of Jesus. In Daniel 4:17, Daniel tells us that God rules over all human governments, and he gives them to whoever he wishes. When you think about that, Daniel says that in the context of being carried away in exile. He was an Israelite who was carried away, literally taken out of his homeland and brought to the land of Babylon. He was exiled to live the rest of his life in a foreign land under the rule of a foreign king. So these may have been words that he would have had to wrestle with. He would have had to think seriously about the fact that here he was carried away into exile as one of God's chosen people by a foreign king, but then to accept the fact that God rules over all human governments. Jesus in Matthew 22, and a passage we'll come back to a couple times, Matthew 22, verse 21, he says, "Give unto Caesar the things that are Caesar's, and unto God the things that are God's." Jesus says this in a response to a question about whether we should pay taxes. The Pharisees were questioning Jesus, and they said, "Jesus, should we pay taxes to the Romans?" Trying to trap him. And Jesus goes beyond simply saying, yes, you should pay taxes, but he actually kind of brings in a bit of an ethic here. He tells us that we should give to Caesar the things that are Caesar's. We should give to the civil authority the things that belong to the civil authority. And we should give to God the things that belong to God. Essentially what he's saying is, you can pay your taxes. You ought to pay your taxes. It is good and right to pay your taxes to Caesar, but it is not good and right to worship Caesar. It is good and right to worship God. He draws a bit of a line there and separates these things. So we submit to authority because it's right. It's the law that God has established. We submit to authority because it's wise. For rulers hold no terror for those who do right, but for those who do wrong. Do you want to be free from the fear of the one in authority? Then do what is right and you'll be commended, for the one in authority is God's servant for your good. As I read this, I thought about that feeling that I have when I'm speeding down Highway 40 and suddenly I see a police officer, and that sinking feeling of, I'm doing wrong and I'm going to be caught. This is what Paul's talking about, right? He's saying that authority is established to actually cause you to do right. There is wisdom in following the authority that's been established. Paul proposes that our world needs leadership or government to create accountability for wrong actions. And he actually proposes as well, not just that we would have accountability for wrong actions, but that the one in authority is God's servant for your good. That our government has a responsibility in some sense to actually work for good, to create good in our world, and that this is the way that God has established it. So, we submit to authority because it's right, because it's wise, and because it's fair. This is also why you pay taxes, for the authorities are God's servants who give their full time to governing. Give to everyone what you owe them. If you owe taxes, pay taxes. If revenue, then revenue. If respect, then respect. If honor, then honor. So Paul kind of adds a third category here, fairness. There's a sense of justice in paying taxes, he says, and submitting to authority, because it reflects the fact that there are people whose job it is to give their full time towards governing. This isn't a defense of big government. This is not a defense of small government. This doesn't say anything about government. This is Paul talking about our relationship as individuals to authority. It's a principle that flows simply back to the fact that workers are worthy of wages, something that we see all the way throughout the Bible. And Paul says we submit to authority because it's fair. We owe honor, respect, and taxes to those in authority because they work on our behalf. Now, yes, but if you've gotten this far with me, I don't doubt that there are a whole bunch of yes, but comments in your mind. I spent my whole week working through the yes, but this doesn't make sense in this context, and yes, but Hitler, and yes, but Pol Pot, and yes, but all the different things that are happening in our world that make a text like this very difficult to deal with, right? So, as we begin to level our complaints against this, it's worthwhile to stop and think again about our context. As I mentioned earlier, they were under the rule. Paul was writing to a group of people who were under the rule of the Roman emperor. This was miles away from democracy. This was the autocratic rule of people that history is often, but by people that history is often labeled as crazy. Paul is writing during the rule of Nero. Nero is not necessarily known as being a reasonable person, right? He didn't turn out to be much of a champion for Christianity. In fact, the whole of the New Testament would seem to point out that Christianity rarely came out on top when it came to those in authority. Jesus was born during the time of Herod. Herod was hardly a champion for believers, was he? Instead, Herod decided to kill all the male Jewish babies born at the time out of a desire to kill preemptively the king of the Jews. At that time, Israel was under Roman occupation. Most of Jesus' followers, and those who didn't follow him, assumed that Jesus was some sort of a zealot, a freedom fighter Messiah, somebody who was going to come and physically free them from the oppressive rule of the Romans. It would be hard to argue that Pontius Pilate was fair or impartial in his dealings with Jesus. When we read through the book of Acts, we see a string of persecution across the early church because of their allegiance to Jesus. I say this to point out that Paul wasn't writing to a Western democracy when he said this. He was writing to a group of people. He was writing to people who were generally subjugated, who were under the authority of someone that they had no control over. It was a far more difficult and unpredictable environment. The church in Rome is a few years away from an upcoming brutal persecution by Nero, who decided to blame them for the Great Fire of Rome, a fire that most historians at that time seem to agree that he himself started. So Paul didn't have our cultural moment in mind when he dictated these words, but he had a far worse cultural moment in mind. His command was still that it was right to submit to the governing authorities. Okay, but really? What do we really do with this? What are the limits that this passage might hint at to that authority? Well, I mentioned earlier, we think very quickly of the different examples of ways that people have used authority that would run directly in contradiction to God's law. You know, when I read about it, I thought quickly of the example of the Nazis, and we're close enough historically to that particular moment to know that blind submission to authority rarely works out well. When I read about rulers not holding terror for those who do right, I can't help but think about the stats in the U.S. about rates of incarceration of young black men, or for First Nations here in Canada. In my neighborhood, I'm part of a local Facebook group, and just for people in our neighborhood, and I am always struck by the perception that economically deprived minorities have about the police in my neighborhood. There's constantly a warning about calling the police too quickly on things, because there's this fear of police that doesn't necessarily reflect people doing wrong, but a concern that there may be a lack of justice. They relate to authority with far more fear than I do. despite the fact that I don't think they're actually doing wrong. More recently, we can point to different places in our world right now where Christians are being persecuted for their faith. We think about Christians in North Korea and wonder what submission to authority looks like when the leader is Kim Jong-un, who maintains a policy of persecution against a small Christian minority. We can think about the recent example of a Finnish member of parliament who's under investigation for inciting hatred, for questioning a church's involvement in a pride parade. I find myself in an interesting position. The organization, so I work for a Christian organization. Our organization is currently involved in a lawsuit. We're suing the government for discrimination because of the changes to the Canada Summer Jobs Grant a few years ago. What does it mean to submit to authority when you're in a lawsuit against the government? I'm not sure. I need to think about that. So what does the passage tell us about the limits to the authority of the government? Well, here's one. Paul's instruction assumes that God's authority assumes God's authority being above human authority. So submission in this context assumes that God's rule is ultimate. So pay attention to the structure that Paul uses to establish the authority of earthly rulers. The authorities that exist have been established by God. For the one in authority is God's servant. So how are they described? Earthly rulers are described as God's servants. Where does that put them in relation to God? That puts them directly below God, right? They're not on an equal playing field with God, where God has parceled out authority to them that they can do whatever they want with. But it's clear that they're under the authority of God as well. So Paul's implying in this language that any authority that secular governments have is borrowed authority. It's subservient authority. Their authority is derived from the fact that God allows it. All of this reminds us that God is first and not rulers. This matters because it kind of cuts both ways for us. On the one hand, we need to obey authority because it's established by God. And on the other hand, it tells us that God's authority is final, not human institutions. So when human institutions call us to break with God's ultimate authority, it's clear that we need to follow God. This is why when Peter, in Acts chapter 5, is confronted by synagogue rulers and told to stop proclaiming Christ, he answers them, we must obey God rather than human beings. Or why Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego in the book of Daniel, they're willing to take on new names, they're willing to live in a foreign land, they're willing to go through all kinds of education to make them more Babylonian, and yet when the king tells them that they need to worship him alone, they reply, King Nebuchadnezzar, we do not need to defend ourselves before you in this matter. If we're thrown into a blazing furnace for obedience, then the God we serve is able to deliver us from it, and he will deliver us from your majesty's hand. But even if he does not, we want you to know, your majesty, that we will not serve your gods or worship the image of gold that you have set up. So it's clear that God's authority is above. Hopefully that's a sigh of relief for us when we read this passage, right? We submit to authority because God's established it, and yet we recognize that ultimately all authority comes from God, and his authority is what matters most. The other thing that we see is that Paul's instructions borrow from Jesus, who talks about spheres of authority. So from Matthew 22, verse 21, well, then he said, give to Caesar what belongs to Caesar and give to God what belongs to God. So it's clear that there are spheres of authority. There's a separation there that Jesus is alluding to and that Paul alludes to in this passage. Caesar may demand both taxes and worship, but Caesar is only owed taxes, right? He can ask for worship, but he's not owed worship. He's owed taxes. God, on the other hand, is owed worship. He's owed our ultimate allegiance. When we scan through the Bible, we get a sense of how this issue of civil disobedience or civil obedience is handled, and we get a fairly unique perspective. On the one hand, we see many times, many examples, when believers submit to and support civil government that are evil in many different ways, right? Stop and think about this. When you read through the Bible, one of the pictures that you get is that believers, Old Testament and New Testament, at different points choose to submit and live under authority that isn't particularly godly, that may actually be evil. We think about this with Joseph living in Potiphar's household, or Joseph and his relationship to Pharaoh. We think about Daniel with Nebuchadnezzar, or Paul in this case with the Roman government. In all cases, the authorities are disobedient to God, but neither Joseph nor Daniel nor Paul disparaged them, or worked against them. On the other hand, we see a lot of examples, a lot of times when believers were required to act in ways that violated the ways of God, and they courageously disobeyed the civil authorities. Again, we have the example of Daniel and his friends. We have the example of the Hebrew midwives in the Exodus who delivered baby boys against the command of Pharaoh. So the principle is this, and this is from Tim Keller. He says, Paul's radical principle is we obey our government out of our Christian conscience, out of our obedience to God alone. This is radical, for it cuts two ways. On the one hand, we will obey the state even when there's no civil consequences. So if the police went away tomorrow, if there were no longer any consequences for breaking the law, as followers of Jesus, we would continue to follow the law out of a desire to honor Jesus. So on the one hand, this is radical, for it cuts two ways. On the one hand, we will obey the state even when there's no civil consequences because our motivation is obedience to the God who established the state. On the other hand, we can never submit uncritically to what the state tells us. If it requires us to violate our conscience, we must disobey. So practically speaking, what does this mean for us? Now, it means that we submit to God first. It means that when our government asks us to act in contravention to the law of God, we have a biblical mandate to refuse. God's law is above the law of the land. Our history is full of rich examples of Christians who did this. I mentioned World War II earlier. World War II is full of examples of times when Christians, for example, in World War II, Christians chose against the law to protect the lives of their Jewish friends and neighbors. This was against the law, and yet God's law prevailed. They realized that what they were being asked to do in turning their friends over to death and turning their neighbors over to death was against the law of God. So they chose to protect them. So we submit to God first. We submit to authority second. This one actually matters. Stop and think about this. So we submit to God first, but that doesn't mean that we have kind of a half-hearted commitment to submitting to civil authority, to the government. It doesn't mean that when we simply don't like the government or we see them enacting laws that don't represent us well, that we stop paying our taxes and that we stop submitting to their authority. I say this because we live in a city where sometimes it's really hard to pay taxes. Okay? Lonnie and I went through a major house renovation project a couple of years ago. I don't think I realized how hard it was to actually pay taxes until I tried to have contractors into my home and get them to do work. And I realized that I would ask 3 contractors to come to my house, and at least 2 out of 3 times they would give me 2 different prices. And some of them wouldn't give me the price with tax because they weren't interested in working in that system. And they were shocked and surprised when I said to them, "Could you please give me the price with tax? I would like to pay the tax on this." Not because I like paying tax. I'm Dutch. I don't want to pay tax. I don't want to pay any more money than I have to. However, as a follower of Jesus who's called to live under the authority of God first and the government second, I choose to pay tax. We need to choose to pay tax. It's hard. It costs us, literally. So, we submit to the authority second. Third, we choose to show honor and respect regardless. This is maybe the harder one for us in many ways. So we owe more than taxes and more than obedience. We owe a debt of honor and respect. This is the one that just feels to me very applicable for today because we live in a culture that takes delight in dishonor and disrespect. We live in a culture that takes delight in dishonor and disrespect. Somehow we become a culture that delights in catching people at their worst and use every occasion to denounce our political enemies. This is maybe most clear to us right now because we're in the midst of an election cycle. With the advent of social media and the ubiquity of cell phones, our capacity to catch people at their worst and then magnify their faults is at an all-time high. It is a miserable time to be a politician. Every time I talk with anybody about politics, we all seem to come down to the same thing and say, I would never want to do that. The fact that none of us would ever want to be politicians should tell us something about the culture of dishonor that exists in our country. So I want to pick on one thing in particular in relation to this. How do we honor those and respect those with whom we disagree politically? How do we honor and respect those with whom we disagree politically? I say this because I think this is what the passage implies. We owe a debt of honor and respect, non-negotiable. I've been fascinated this week to watch the news this week. As many of you guys know, this past week our Prime Minister was caught in an unfortunate moment of hypocrisy with these old photographs in blackface. It was embarrassing for him. It exposed him in many ways. What was interesting to me was to watch across my Facebook stream all the different ways that people reacted to it. All the different ways that those who supported him defended him, that those who hated him reviled him, for the ways that those who actually were caught up in the issue were concerned that the actual problem was getting lost in the midst of the politicking. Does that make sense? They actually cared about the issue around racism and felt like in the midst of the discussion, the actual issue was being lost. What struck me was that I saw so many posts of people who reacted with language that was profoundly disrespectful and dishonoring. Name-calling, ad hominem attacks, the kind of thing that you'd expect kids to say to one another on a playground. I'm not saying this to defend Justin Trudeau in any way, any more than I want to defend Donald Trump. But I realize in my language sometimes that I fail to pay the debt of respect and honor that I owe to leaders. I realize in my language, in the way that I talk about leaders, I show a profound disrespect and dishonor to people that God has placed in authority over me. And I owe them a debt of respect. Has anybody watched there's a docuseries a few years ago called Band of Brothers. Anybody watch Band of Brothers? Great, so 3 of you are going to get this analogy. In Band of Brothers, it's about a group of World War II soldiers who are being trained to go to battle in Europe, and then it's the story of them going together. While they are being trained in America, they have a captain who is particularly miserable, that they do not get along with, who works them very hard, and then they wind up over in Europe, and they realize that this man is actually something of a coward when placed in battle situations. Okay? At one point, one of the men that he trains actually surpasses this incompetent captain in rank. And there's this powerful moment where they're walking by one another, and the less experienced man, Captain Winter, salutes his former captain as he's walking by. And his former captain, who is now a lower rank than him, simply shrugs and walks by. And he stops him. Captain Winter stops Captain Sobel and says, "We salute the rank, not the man," and insists that the other man salute him. We salute the rank, not the man. This, to me, this idea that we salute the rank and not the man, is the principle that Paul's driving at here when it comes to our relationship with authority. You may have strong feelings about any number of politicians, and yet what Paul's saying is, we salute the rank and not the man. We salute the rank. We salute the person's authority that God has given them. We show respect and honor, regardless of whether we agree with them. And this is part of what God's calling us to, I believe, in this passage. And I say this because Paul continues his argument. So we've zoomed in really tight on a particular issue that Paul wants the church in Rome to wrestle with. How do they get along around the table when it comes to this issue of government? So to put this back into context quickly, and we'll close with this, to put this back into context, we began this by saying that Paul wants to address a particular issue in the church, that there are two groups of people, the strong and the weak. The weak are people who have been marginalized by the government and exiled and have no room, no time to show respect or honor to those in authority, and no desire to show any kind of submission to them. The strong are those who have had a good relationship with the government and have no problem showing respect and honor and submission to the government. And Paul says to both of them, we need to submit to those in authority over us, trusting that God has put them in that position. We need to do this because it's right, because it's fair, because it's wise. And then he zooms back out at the end of this, and here's what he says. Let no debt remain outstanding except the continuing debt to love one another. For whoever loves others has fulfilled the law. And I want to end with this because I think what Paul's saying is after this difficult teaching to two groups that's going to be received differently by different groups of people, he zooms back out and he says, okay, there's an issue in the church over here, and here's how I want you to deal with it. And then he zooms back out and he says, but in all of these things, don't forget that there is an ongoing debt of love that you owe to one another. So there's a particular issue over here, but what I want you to keep in mind as you think about this issue, as you sit around the dinner table in an uncomfortable way sometimes because you realize that you have different perspectives on the government, you have different perspectives on authority, zoom back out and don't forget that the larger command that I want you to live within the context of is this command to love one another. Because Paul's concern wasn't simply to address one small issue related to a difference in opinion on how people related to the authority of the government. But at the end of the day, Paul's concern was that the church in Rome would be able to share a common table as brothers and sisters in Christ, despite the fact that they might disagree with one another. And the only way that we can do that, the only way that we can have healthy conversations about government, about authority, and about our need to show honor when we disagree, is if we genuinely believe that we owe an ongoing debt of love to one another, because whoever loves one another has fulfilled the law. So, all of this to say, we owe an ongoing debt of love to one another. We owe it to one another in this room. We owe it to those who are in authority. We owe an ongoing debt of love to one another, and that's bigger than respect and honor. So let's close there. Father, thank you that we see in the book of Romans an example of how to deal with hard issues in the church. Thank you that we see that the gospel wasn't just a message that told us something about what happens after we die, but that Paul links this back to the gospel and says the way that we relate to one another in love, in honor, in respect, in choosing to live under authority reflects something of the way that you've made us to live, that this reflects the order that you have set up. So we pray, Lord, would you help us to be a people who chooses honor and respect in the way that we relate to authority and submission? Would we be a people who continue to live with a sense of an ongoing debt of love to one another because we know what it is to be loved and forgiven and to be brought into your family? So we pray this in Jesus' name. Amen.